All right, everyone. Happy Monday. Hello, hello. Can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure. If I didn't ask, I bet even if you couldn't hear me, you probably wouldn't say anything. Nah. All right, so I have a few reminders. Then we're going to finish the knee, and then we are going to start the foot and ankle. Okay, here come the reminders. I hope you're ready. As you know, because of our updated schedule, we know that our fourth lecture exam, our last lecture exam, is next Monday. So 1 week from today, we have our fourth exam, and it will be on the lower body. So pelvis and hip, knee, ankle, and foot. Same as always, we'll have you sign on with Zoom with your video on as you take it on Moodle. And next Monday, we will only have the lecture exam in lecture. And of course, as you have questions, because I know you're going to be studying hard, I am available. Also next week, we are coming down the home stretch, folks. Next week starts our lab presentations. Believe it or not, we only have 3 weeks of coursework left. So today we're going to do this week, we're covering ankle. Next week, we have our fourth lecture exam. And then Thursday in lecture, we're going to be doing the neck and spine. This week is our last actual lab to do. And then next week and the following week are your lab presentations. I'm going to share the screen because I have put the schedule up on Moodle for you. As I do that, feel free to shout out any questions that you may have. So on Moodle, I'm going to scroll down to where there was already information on the final lab project. So these are the same, the instructions, the tables, and the grading matrix, but what I added this morning was the presentation dates and times. You already know what you signed up for. So what I've done is I've simply just put you in order for that day. This is on Moodle, so you don't necessarily need to write it down now. Remember, some of you were kind enough to switch your lab day. So just don't forget, this is what you agreed to, and I hope you're still able to do it. If not, you need to let me know. The presentations are no more than 10 minutes. I'm going to have my stopwatch. So you want to practice, right? Points will come off if it's too short or too long. Not like a minute too short, because that'd be ridiculous. But if it's like overly short, or if you don't get to everything, points are coming off. So you want to practice your presentation so it is 10 minutes. We're going to move quickly the next 2 weeks in lab with this. So know who you're after, because once the person ahead of you is done, I'm going to call you up, and my expectation is that you're ready to start within a minute or two. You can use any supplies that are available in the supply closet in the gym. So use This Week in Lab, if you haven't already, to go in that supply closet and see what supplies you might want to use. When we have these presentations, if you're using supplies, get them out of the supply closet before lab starts. Get there early. Go to the supply closet, bring your supplies out to the gym and set them to the side so that when it's your time, they're right there. Even if you are not presenting on a day, I expect you to be there. So if it's your scheduled lab date, I expect you to be there. And if you're not, the same principle will apply as it has all semester. 5 percentage points comes off your lab grade for every unexcused absence. Also remember, your actual paper copy of your final lab project is due the day that you present, right? So your written summary and your tables, your paper copy of your final lab project is due the day you present. All right, I'm going to open the floor for questions. What do you got?
Are we handing you that final, whatever you want to call it, or are we uploading it?
I would prefer a hand copy so it's easier for me to grade if I can write on it. And then what I'll do is I'll return them to you when we meet. Oh shit. We're not meeting. That's a good question. Is the final exam in person or is it virtual? Does anybody know?
I think if the class is virtual, then the exam is virtual. And if it's in person, then it's in person.
Damn it, because usually what I do is I return your final lab projects the day of the final. But you're probably right. If our lecture course is virtual, the final exam will be virtual. So what I'll have to do then is I'll have to set some times up where I will come onto campus. Maybe I'll be in the gym or something, and you can come that last during finals week. You can come pick it up. So I prefer a hard copy, which means please give me a hard copy. Other questions?
When are the lab workbooks due?
I was going to address that next. Thank you, Gretchen. I will talk about that in a moment. Any other questions about the lab project? We're coming down the home stretch here. Okay. All right, so your cumulative lab workbook is going to be due next week whenever you have lab. So your cumulative lab workbook will be due to me in hard copy, please. Your cumulative lab workbook will be due to me either next Monday, if you're coming to Monday's lab, right at 4 when we start, or next Thursday, the 22nd, if you're coming to Thursday's lab. That shouldn't be a big ask because you've been filling it out as you go along. But you don't want to miss any easy, because I am going to grade them page by page, so you don't want to be missing any points on that. So that'll be due either next Monday, if you're coming to lab on Monday at 4 p.m. when you walk in the door at lab, or it'll be due next Thursday, April 22nd at 4 o'clock when you walk in the lab. And then I'll be able to turn around and return those to you the last week when we meet in lab. You got questions? I got answers. Any other questions for the good of the order? All righty. The excitement is overwhelming, as always. Oh yeah, one more reminder for lab this week. We're going to be doing the foot and ankle, and we are going to be doing some palpations. So that means I'm going to ask you to take off your shoe and your sock. I know people freak out, like they'll palpate the pelvis, but some people will freak out about touching their own feet. I don't care. So be prepared in lab today or Thursday. Take off your shoes and socks, and we are going to palpate. Sound like a plan? Okay. Okay, before we get started on the knee, to finish that, I do apologize. I have my phone set to vibrate because I'm expecting a very important call. So if I get that call, I am going to just walk outside for a moment to just get it really quickly. I wouldn't do it unless it was really important. So if that happens, I'll just step away briefly, but don't go anywhere. Okay, let's talk about the knee. Let's finish it up. All right, let me open up the knee. The knee. All right. We ended up by talking about the IT band. Let me just get my bearing here. We talked about loads at the knee, didn't we? Yes. We talked about the patellofemoral, we talked about the Q angle. Okay. All right, so if I remember correctly, we are listed here in our notes, right along letter E, muscle analysis. Okay, if you have questions, just go ahead and ask. So we already know there's 4 quadricep muscles. Make sure you can list them, right? We already know what the primary action of the quads is. What is the primary action of the quads? It's going to wake you up a little bit. Knee extension, right? So the primary action of the quads is to extend at the knee, with one exception, the rectus femoris, because its proximal tendon attaches on the pelvis. The rectus femoris can also do what?
Flex the hip.
Thank you. Flex the hip. So if we look at the quadriceps and their ability to do knee extension, we can actually break down that motion of knee extension. Here, let me come back here for a sec. If I could figure this out, I would be dangerous. Wait, I'm already sharing the screen. No, I'm not. Okay. We can actually break this down, right? So if we think about knee extension, starting here and extending, we can actually break that motion down and specify. So the most common example of this is the last 20 degrees. So from about 20 degrees of flexion to 0, that last 20 degrees or so of extension is primarily done by the vastus medialis. So that last 20 degrees, even though all the quads work together, that last 20 degrees of extension is really working mostly the vastus medialis. This is written in your notes. It's also in the PowerPoint. Right, so that last 20 degrees is utilizing mostly the vastus medialis. If you sit there and do knee extensions in the last 20 degrees over and over again, you'll be most sore in the vastus medialis. That middle region, so in the middle of that extension motion from about 30 to 60 degrees of flexion, we're relying mostly on the rectus femoris. So know these ranges, these degrees. So about the mid-range, 30 to 60 degrees of flexion, we're relying mostly on the rectus femoris, which means that the vastus lateralis is responsible for the beginning parts of extension, from 90 degrees of flexion until we get to about 60 degrees of flexion.
Professor, I have a quick question. So you said for the rectus femoris, So all of the quad muscles, they do knee extension, but the rectus femoris also does hip flexion. Is that what you said?
That's correct. So as an athletic trainer, if someone has a quad strain, I can actually test each of the individual quad muscles, right? I could have them with their knees flexed to 90, and I could have them push out against my hand, and I would be assessing mostly the vastus lateralis. If I test their quad in more of the mid-range of extension, I would be focusing more on the rectus femoris. And if I wanted to see if they had strained their vastus medialis more so, I would test them almost at full extension. Pretty cool. All right, you already know the hamstring to quad ratio, right? It's on your notes there, don't forget. Usually we say the hamstring should be between 60 to 80% of the quads. Comparatively, we say the hamstring should be about 60 to 80% of the quads. Good. We talked about the muscles. Okay. So we have already talked about load. So we talked a lot about compressive loads on the knee last Thursday. A couple notes on torque. I've tried to put, or I have put, in underline and bold the things that I'd like you to know. In comparison to the upper extremity, so if we were just to compare the upper extremity to the knee has less acceleration and deceleration forces. That shouldn't be surprising, right? I mean, the baseball throw, we generate so much acceleration and deceleration. We don't have nearly as much acceleration and deceleration in a soccer kick. But we tend to have more rotation, and particularly more rotation with the foot planted. We don't have that as often in the shoulder, unless you're a gymnast doing handstands and cartwheels and stuff, when you're actually weight bearing on your upper extremity. So something that's unique about the knee and the lower extremity is that there's less acceleration or deceleration forces, and any torque that we have is occurring at slower speeds of rotation, but we can have quite a bit of rotation, and it really can add stress to the knee because we often rotate with our foot planted. Think about a running back planting their foot and then changing directions. Think about a soccer kick. You approach and you plant your opposite foot before you come through and kick the ball. When we compare the hip and the knee in terms of torque, so instead of comparing upper to lower body, if we were just to compare the knee at the hip tends to have actually more torque. And it may be harder to understand because it's not necessarily because of motion that we would think of. The hip generates a lot of torque because it has really, really strong muscles attaching around it. So the really strong muscles that attach around the hip, when they contract, those tendons pulling on it apply some torque. So even though just basic comparison of torque, hip to knee, there's most likely more torque at the hip. Even though that's true, the knee has much less bony support. So even though the numbers of torque, the Newton meters of torque, are not as high as the hip, it can be just as, if not more stressful on the knee ligaments. So even though numbers wise, the hip probably experiences more torque, if we were to put a number to it, 500 Newton meters at the hip versus 400 Newton meters to the knee. So even though by numbers, the hip may experience more torque, because the knee has less bony support, the knee experiences just as much stress from that torque, if not more, because it's less stable. This is why we see a lot of ligament sprains at the knee. We have a lot of torque forces. It may not be as much numerically as the hip, but because the knee has less bony support, much of that stress from the torque goes to the ligaments. And they, of course, will fail at a certain amount. Good. I've given you some numbers from an isokinetic machine. We did this in lab, in the muscle lab, where we compared the hamstring to quad ratio. I'm just, you don't need to know these numbers. I'm just giving you some data just to have it. Here are some examples of torque that can be put on the knee. You don't need to know these numbers, but I like to give examples. So I've given you the Newton meters, which is the metric version, but I've also converted the Newton meters into foot-pounds of torque, because that's something we can imagine. So the peak torque of quads usually, so if you're doing a knee extension exercise, you may experience as much as 48.7 foot-pounds of torque just on the knee from the pool of the quads. That's a lot. And it's not just straight compressive force. This is a rotary force, whole different ball of wax. The hamstrings, because they're not as strong as the quads, won't put as much torque on the knee, but it's still a decent amount. Not going to ask these numbers, just some examples for you. Here are some comparisons to other joints. As I said, the hip is going to experience more torque. The hip has more torque than the knee, but because the knee doesn't have as much bony support, the knee will experience just as much, if not more, stress from that torque. Okay. Okay, I've intimated this in lab last week, so now I'm just putting it all together. We've already established that women are much more likely to experience an ACL tear compared to men. Excuse me. That doesn't mean that men never tear their ACLs. Of course they do. But if you look at the statistics, women are much more likely. You see a list of reasons why in your notes. Be able to list at least, 3 or 4 of these, okay? So women tend to have less overall muscle strength around the knee. Women have a higher Q angle, which put more valgus force on the knee, stressing the ACL more. Females tend to have looser ligaments to begin with. They're more lax. Landing technique, as we did in lab, because of the higher Q angle, women are more likely to land in a position that puts much more stress on the ACL. Women have a narrower femoral notch. Some people say that some research shows that maybe the ACL becomes looser or more lax during a female's menstrual cycle. Some research has shown that to be true. Other research doesn't show a difference, but it certainly is a possible contributor. So be able to list 3 or 4 of those. Okay, good. Last thing here is injuries to the knees. I do want to make one point before we go into some specifics. The knee is a common place to have an injury, right? Yes. So a lot of forces get directed to the knee. But one thing I want to point out is sometimes there's an injury elsewhere, but the symptoms will manifest at the knee. So it's very possible for someone to have a hip problem or a foot problem, right? It's very common for someone to have a hip or a foot problem, but their initial signs and symptoms are actually at the knee. Why might that be?
Compensating.
So it could be because of compensation. If there's a problem with the hip, the knee might try and compensate by contracting this muscle group more than the other, etc. Why else?
Could it be because it's a halfway point between the hip and the foot?
Well, it is. Be more specific. How would that, why would that matter?
Well, based on my knowledge, I'd have to say that I'm not quite sure.
That is okay to say. Absolutely. Well, as we discussed before in on Thursday's lecture, the knee often experiences more compression than the hip, and the knee just is more likely to experience more valgus and varus force. The hip, because it has very strong bony support, the hip, because it is less mobile, sometimes won't be the first to show symptoms, right? I'm not going to ask you specifics about this on the exam next Monday, other than just the straight on fact that in addition to having an actual knee injury at the knee, just know that many times there could be an injury at the hip or the foot, and it can manifest with symptoms at the knee. So someone has knee pain, but the initial problem wasn't actually at the knee. All right. We're going to go through these quickly. You don't have to know them all, as usual. Obviously, we'll talk about an ACL tear. It's the most common. Look at that second point in your notes. Usually tears completely or not at all. Put a little star beside that one. Circle, star. So it tends to be the ACL, either it doesn't tear or it tears at all. You're much less likely to see a grade 2 ACL sprain. This is different from the MCL. So it's much more common to have different degradations of tearing. A grade 1, a grade 2, pretty common. But with the forces on the ACL the way that they are, it tends to either tear a little bit or tear completely. There's not usually much in between. And then also notice letter C there on your notes. The majority of the ACL tears are non-contact. So this picture I have of the basketball player, she didn't get hit, she didn't get tackled. She just had weight on that left foot, and then she changed position and tore her ACL. Or think of a basketball player going up for a layup and then coming down and landing, tearing their ACL. All the rest there is extra. Just review letters B and C. We know that the PCL is much less likely to tear. If we compare the MCL and LCL, of course, the MCL tear is more common. An MCL tear, as we already know, occurs because of a valgus force. Do I have this on here? Make sure you look there at the quote unquote unhappy triad. Have you ever heard of that before?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not a good thing, but if someone has a serious enough knee injury, we tend to see a pattern where 3 of the same structures tend to get damaged. So an ACL tear, if it's a really bad knee injury, it's pretty likely that you'll see a combination, ACL tear and MCL tear or injury and a medial meniscus injury. If you damage all 3 of those, you are the proud winner of the unhappy triad. You don't want it.
My mom did that to her knee. So she has no ACL or MCL, and they didn't repair it because she was too old and not like athletic. It was bad, but yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about your mother, but that was Alicia, right?
Yeah.
By the way, I have my iPad over here, so when I'm looking, I can see my Zoom on the iPad. I'm not looking at something else. But Alicia brings up a very good point. You know, if we had more time, we could talk about this for a long time. But probably people in your age bracket and the people that you hang out with, athletes, they're likely to have their ACL surgically repaired. But there's many instances where it's just not worth it. So someone who is older, who may not be as likely to have a good recovery. And if someone's not that active, quite frankly, and they're older particularly, they'll just put a brace on there or do some rehab to strengthen the muscles around it and let it be. Also, think about an 11-year-old. So an 11-year-old tears their ACL. Why might they not have surgery right away?
Because they're still growing.
What's still growing? Be specific.
Everything.
Particularly in an ACL reconstruction, they go through and they thread a new ligament and they drill it into the bone. Well, these bones are still growing in length. So you don't want to be drilling a hole to anchor down your new ligament at the end of the bone if they're not done growing. And also we remember the last place that a bone grows is the growth plate or the epiphyseal line, which is right here. And that's very close, if not into the territory where they'll drill in that new bone tunnel to anchor the new ligament. They'll wait until they're more fully grown. All right, so just make sure you can list the 3 things that would be injured if someone has the unhappy triad. Alicia, you should not get that question wrong if it's on the test.
I won't.
We already talked about the meniscus. The only thing I want you to review with the meniscus is the number 2 on your notes, that there's different regions, that the outer region of the menisci will heal the best because it's closest to blood supply. All the rest there is extra. Okay. Let's move on to the lower leg, ankle, and foot. All right. If you don't mind, I'm just gonna run to the restroom real quick. And I'll be right back. So give me a minute. Stop the share here. All right, thanks for being patient, everyone. We have made it all the way down to the ankle and foot. All of our intro chapters, then the upper body, and here we are, lower body, last joint. You're not very excited. Okay, so have a look there at the beginning of your notes. We obviously know the ankle and foot are going to bear a lot of weight. And what's really important about the foot and ankle is that it's our contact point to the ground. Being that we're bipedal, we walk upright, we're putting all of our body weight and the contact point between our body weight and the ground, foot and ankle. And you can see there in that first letter A there, the foot and ankle not only have the responsibility of bearing a lot of weight, they also have to be flexible and allow for mobility. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. We have to have a network of joints that is strong and stable, right? We have to put bones and ligaments together that provide a lot of support because our entire body weight is on our foot and ankle. So it's got to be strong and stable. But at the same time, it has to be flexible and mobile because it's how we walk. So we're really asking a lot. It's like we're combining the knee and the shoulder. We want a lot of stability and support, knee, but we also want a lot of mobility, shoulder. So biomechanically, we're asking a lot of this area, and it is quite complex. And as you probably are familiar with, any problems we have with this area can really be a pain because it is so complex. Okay, I'm going to review the anatomy, but I'm going to do it pretty quickly. So if you haven't already brushed up on your foot and ankle anatomy, you're going to have to do some reviewing. But you got time till next week. Okay, you know the tibia and the fibula. I'm not even going to waste my time talking about those two lower leg bones. You know the medial and lateral malleolus, and in lab we're going to palpate that. Of course, the medial malleolus is the bump on the inside of the tibia. Lateral malleolus is bump on the outside of the fibula. Make sure you review the tarsal bones. Remember, we had carpals that were up here in the wrist, carpals. Now we have tarsals. I think about T for toe. Tarsals are down by the feet. You have the calcaneus or heel bone. The talus sits right above it. We have the navicular, which is on the medial side. We have the cuboid on the lateral side, and then 3 cuneiform bones. Sometimes they're called medial, intermediate, or lateral cuneiform. Sometimes they're called cuneiform 1, 2, and 3. So review, learn, whatever you have to do for these bones. By the way, well, you can see it in your notes. I was going to ask it, but the answer is kind of there. Probably the most important bone in the hind foot is the talus. So, you know, everyone probably knows the calcaneus because it's our heel. But the bone that sits on top of it, called the talus, is more important. So we will be spending quite some time talking about the talus. Make sure you review the metatarsals, 1 through 5. 1 is on the big toe side. And then we have the phalanges, toes. Make sure you review these bones. It is also important to know that these bones are often separated into regions. And I just used the term hind foot. The hind foot is basically your calcaneus and talus. Then we have your midfoot, the navicular, cuboid, and cuneiforms. And then we have the forefoot, metatarsals and phalanges. So just know that this is also a way to designate them. If you think about like injuries, you've probably heard of like a midfoot sprain. So because the foot and ankle are so complex, sometimes it's nearly impossible to distinguish if someone sprained a ligament here, which specific one it is. So it's pretty common, for example, to just say midfoot sprain. So you know you've sprained 1 or more ligaments between these midfoot bones. Good. By golly, you're going to be anatomy experts by the time the final exam comes, right? Where's the confidence? I get nothing? I know how to spark your interest. Talk about something else. One of my favorite shows is Last Chance U on Netflix. They have a basketball season now up there. Has anybody else watched that show before? Can you hear me at least?
Yep, I watched it.
I suppose I'm interested in Last Chance U because of, of working at Hudson Valley and seeing athletes there. Anyway, they have a basketball one now. It's really good. Okay.
Yeah, the skill level is just about the same at Hudson Valley. So
Is that a compliment or a diss?
however you want to take it.
That was very, very political, Jake. Well done. As a side note, I believe, and I'm hoping some of you do too, a lot of times we do a disservice to people. If they're really good at sports, we channel them into that and don't provide them with a backup plan. And so few people go on to make money as a professional. So a lot of times we set these kids up for failure. Do we agree, disagree?
I agree.
At least somebody's saying something. See, I talked about something else and you guys started talking. Anatomy, I get nothing. That's okay though. I'm used to it. Okay, the distal tibiofibular joint. Now that's fun. Make sure you know it's there. I put a circle here. It is the distal, which means further away. Tibiofibular joint, joint between the tibia and the fibula. It doesn't really have any motion. So you can see on your notes there, it says movements allowed. There really isn't any motion. So we aren't going to talk about it a whole lot. Although I would like you to know, we do have some very important ligaments at this joint, particularly the anterior tibiofibular ligament. That's what this is right here. Anterior tibiofibular ligament. It's on the anterior side, and that ligament runs between the tibia and the fibula. Sometimes it's shortened just to be called the tib-fib ligament. If someone sprains this ligament, what kind of injury is it called? What's like the lay term? Anybody know? It's the kind of sprain that you don't want at your ankle because it takes longer to heal.
High ankle sprain?
Yeah. I can see Michael's dog. Hi. Michael, who is that? Can you introduce me? Us?
Well, she's gone now, but her name's Callie. She's my brother's dog.
Oh. She looked very sweet. Is she?
She's a brute, but yeah, she's a good girl.
You said she's a brute?
Yeah, she'll just ram you, like for no reason, just run up to you and just smoke you with the crown of her head.
Like a bowling ball, probably, right?
Yeah, it's not fun.
So indeed, if this ligament is sprained, it's called a high ankle sprain, and it takes longer to heal. You don't want a high ankle sprain, but a high ankle sprain is damage to the anterior tibiofibular ligament. I'd like you to know that. A high ankle sprain is damage to the anterior tibiofibular ligament. All right. I mentioned the talus, didn't I? I said, yeah, the calcaneus we all know because it's the heel bone, but sitting on top of the calcaneus is a very important bone called the talus. On this picture on the left of the screen, we can see the dome of the talus. So the top of it has this dome-like structure. That's what we're seeing here. The true ankle joint is called the talocrural joint. It is the joint between the talus and the tibia and the fibula. So you know how we've been defining each joint, like the hip is the acetofemoral joint, the knee is the tibiofemoral joint. Well, the true ankle, if you're talking about the ankle joint, it's really technically the talocrural joint, which is the joint between the talus and the tibia and fibula. And we can see that here, the talus connects with the tibia and the fibula. So interestingly, the calcaneus does not touch the tibia and fibula at all. The actual joint is the talocrural, talus and tibia and fibula. You don't need to know the articulating surfaces. So don't worry about the specific articulating surfaces. We can simply appreciate that by looking at it. So we can look and we can see the dome of the talus, that rounded top of the talus. And then we can see how the tibia and fibula sit over top, with the medial malleolus and lateral malleolus coming over the sides. I would like to add a term here. This arrangement, the arrangement of how the tibia and fibula come down over top the talus, that connection where it's like a hood and it comes down on either side, that connection is called a mortise. And I wrote it there, M-O-R-T-I-S-E. It's really a way to strengthen the bony connection, isn't it? If we just had the end of the bones come down like that, it wouldn't be as stable. But by having the end of the tibia come down on the medial side and the end of the fibula come down on the lateral side, we have this hood. And it's really a good system because it's stable, but it allows a good amount of motion. The talus can move pretty easily forward and backward. What type of joint do you think the talocrural joint is? What type of synovial joint?
Modified hinge?
I can see where you're going with that. However, the talocrural joint itself is a hinge joint. We don't have to add modified. The talocrural joint itself is a hinge joint. Now, a little bit later, we're going to talk about the other joints in the foot that allow the foot to do all sorts of motions. Because it's true, the ankle can do much more than just flex and extend. But the other motions that the foot and ankle can do are a result of many, many different joints. If we isolate just the talocrural joint, if we were to isolate just the talocrural joint, it is a hinge joint, which means it can only do flexion or extension. Of course, in the ankle, we call it something else. What do we call these motions at the ankle?
Plantar flexion and dorsiflexion.
Yeah. So instead of calling it just flexion and extension, we call this motion at the ankle dorsiflexion, pointing your toe up, plantar flexion, pointing the toes down. Thought I had a, okay. So if I were to ask you a question like, what motions are allowed specifically at the talocrural joint? If I were to ask you what motions are allowed at the talocrural joint, it would be dorsiflexion and plantar flexion only. Even though we know that the foot and ankle has many joints that work together to allow the foot and ankle to move in many more ways. Good, good, good. Some other pictures. Here's actually a cadaver picture where they've taken away all the muscles, human cadaver, and you can see just the bones and just the ligaments. What a great mortise though, right? The dome of the talus with the tibia and the fibula sitting on top, and then the medial malleolus and lateral malleolus forming that nice hood. Pretty cool, isn't it? Okay, so the supporting structures, you can read, it says the talocrural joint has a relatively thin and weak joint capsule. So the joint capsule around the talocrural joint isn't particularly strong, which means that we have to rely on other stuff for its stability. So the talocrural joint gets most of its stability similar to the way that the humeral ulnar joint gets its stability. Who can remind us what provided most of the stability in the humeral ulnar joint? What provided most of the stability to the humeral ulnar joint? Dazzle me with your knowledge.
Wasn't it half bony stability and half ligament?
Yes! Woo! So the talocrural joint relies on things for stability, much like the elbow. So here at the talocrural joint, it gets about half of its stability from bones and half of its stability from ligaments. So the talocrural joint, it gets its stability pretty much 50% from bones, bony congruency, and 50% from ligaments. How about those ligaments? I would venture to say that pretty much everybody in this class has sprained their ankle at some point. Is this a true statement? Yes. So the ligaments that you're spraining of your ankle are commonly the ligaments around the talocrural joint. Let's start on the medial side. This is a picture of the medial ankle. And I've put a circle here, the larger circle. This entire complex of ligaments is collectively known as the deltoid ligaments. So here it says, posterior portion of deltoid, medial portion of deltoid, blah, 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 blah. But on the medial side of the ankle, we tend to consider these ligaments as a group. This one, this one, this one, and this one as the as the deltoid ligaments. It's called deltoid because deltoid means triangular in shape. There's more or less 3 big bands here. Kind of like there's 3 sections to our deltoid muscle over our shoulder. Would you say it's common to sprain these medial ligaments or not?
Not common.
Not common. It's much more common to sprain the lateral ones. So we don't tend to injure the medial ones that often, just because we don't tend to have the mechanism, the force, going in that direction. On the lateral side, I'm going to start with this picture. And I've tried to make it easier. I'm not sure how successful I've been. But I've put these red lines. And I did this because if you visualize the lateral ligaments, so now we're on the lateral side, they more or less form a T. So we have the upper parts of the T here, and then the down part of the T. The down part of the T is called the calcaneofibular ligament. You should know these. Why is it called that? Because it goes between the calcaneus and the fibula. calcaneofibular ligament, goes between the calcaneus and the fibula, bottom part of the T. We're obviously on the lateral side of the ankle because we see the tibia. I mean the fibula, excuse me. Then we have the top part of the T, and they have the same name. We just slap either an anterior or posterior in front of them. The one that you may have heard of, maybe not, but you may have, is the anterior talofibular ligament, ATF. This is the most commonly sprained ligament in the ankle, the ATF, anterior talofibular ligament. Goes between the talus and the fibula on the anterior side. And then likewise, we have a posterior talofibular ligament. Be careful because these terms start to sound alike. Here we're talking about the talofibular, where we previously talked about the tibiofibular. That was the high ankle sprain, tibiofibular. So just be careful that you pay attention to the spelling. Okay, good. Don't worry about, no, that's good. Never mind. Good stuff, my friends. Okay, that's it for the talocrural joint. And we remember that the talocrural joint is the actual ankle, joint between the talus and the tibia and fibula. Moving on. So remember how we were talking about the talus. Talus is really, I'm going to step away for a second for this call. Pardon me, I'm really sorry. Hello? Yes. I did. All right, thank you very much. Okay, bye. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. You still there?
Yeah.
Okay, it's like when the teacher's out, you're gonna go play, huh? Okay, as I said, I wouldn't do it unless it was really important, so I apologize for interrupting. All right, so we talked about the importance of the talus. It tends to be called the keystone bone in the foot. It's most important. So we already talked about how the talus connects to the tibia and fibula, right? So we talked about the true ankle joint. So that's important. It's important for us to look at where the talus connects to the tibia and fibula. But it's also important for us to discuss where the talus connects to the calcaneus. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the subtalar joint. So if I zoom in, I've put more red lines here to try and accentuate the subtalar joint. The subtalar joint is the joint between the talus and the calcaneus. So where these red lines are is more or less where the talus articulates with the calcaneus. And that joint between the bottom part of the talus and the calcaneus is called the subtalar joint. Have any of you heard about this joint before? Have you heard the name subtalar joint? Yes, no, maybe? Don't all talk at once now. Okay. Well, this joint is really important. It's probably equally as important, if not more important, than the talocrural joint. So, you know, this picture is showing you the true ankle joint, the talocrural joint, which we already discussed. But just as important is the other joint that the talus is involved in, the subtalar joint. Okay, in terms of the articulating surfaces, you don't need to know any specifics. Just know that the subtalar joint is the joint between the talus and the calcaneus. All right. The subtalar joint is a gliding joint. And it has some considerable gliding motion, and we're going to talk about it. But as a synovial joint, the subtalar joint is classified as a gliding joint. Okay. You can read all what I'm going to say, and I put those in your notes so you wouldn't have to worry about writing down as much. You could actually listen at the same time or listen. When we talk about the subtalar joint, this is where we get that inversion and eversion. So it's kind of unique. Usually when we've classified a joint as a gliding joint, we didn't define what kind of gliding it does, but here we are. So the subtalar joint is a gliding joint, but it can do a significant amount of gliding. And particularly, this is where we tend to see more of the inversion and eversion, right? Inversion is to move the foot in, eversion is to move the foot out. So if we break it down, even though it's not how the ankle works, because the ankle works where all the joints work together, but if we were to isolate, we would say the subtalar joint is where we have the ability to do inversion and eversion. And the true ankle joint, or the talocrural joint, is where we're able to do dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. But as you can see on your notes, look, but these motions are not independent. So as I've been saying, the joints in and around the ankle and foot work together. The joints of the foot and ankle work together. I'm going to introduce pronation and supination. I know that we talked about this in the forearm. So previously, we've only talked about the motions of pronation and supination that can occur at the forearm. Pronate is to put your palm down. Supination is to put your palm up, right? This is movement at the proximal radioulnar joint. But we also use the terms pronation and supination in the foot. Now, I have listed here what pronation is and what supination is. So I'm going to talk about these, but you don't have to know this list. So you're not going to have, I'm not going to ask you what 3 motions make up pronation. I'm not going to ask what 3 motions make up supination. But I want to list them anyway. Technically, pronation is a combination of eversion of the subtalar joint, dorsiflexion of the talocrural joint, and abduction of other joints in the foot. On the other hand, supination of the foot is a combination of inversion at the subtalar joint, plantar flexion at the talocrural joint, and adduction of the toes, basically. So this is how all the joints work together. I would like you to overall know what foot pronation is and foot supination is. These are pictures from behind of someone's right foot. Here's the calcaneus. Big toe is on this side, pinky toe is on this side. Same thing here. Right foot, here's the calcaneus, big toe, little toe. Pronation is when, oh, I'm so sorry, everybody. I have this call. It's about my mom who was sick in a nursing home. I'll be right back. I really apologize. Hello? Okay, just, one more quick question. So in 6 months, they would look at it and then they would decide. Okay. 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 Okay, thank you for the call. I really appreciate it. Okay, thank you. No worries. Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm gonna have to deal with this phone call. So I'm just gonna end it here. I appreciate your patience. It was something that I couldn't, I had to deal with. We'll pick up here where we left off. I will be in lab by 4. So thank you for your patience. I really apologize. Make sure you've signed in. And then I'll see you in lab.
No worries. Hope everything works out.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you. Hello. I would like to, just because it's convenient. Oh, okay. That's okay. I'm pretty flexible because I'm working from home, except for Monday and Thursday afternoon. But everything else I can pretty much do. Monday or Thursday. But otherwise, I'm pretty much available all the time, so it should be pretty easy. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Bye.